Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and it's my honor to welcome our guest this evening. I say honor because Mr. Frazier is one of the finest prose craftsmen working today. If you live in Philadelphia, you'll recall that we celebrated his talents in 2016 when we chose his National Book Award-winning novel, Cold Mountain, as the city's One Book, One Philadelphia read. That celebration reached its apogee with Opera Philadelphia's production of Jennifer Higdon's opera Cold Mountain, which won the prestigious International Opera Award for Best World Premiere in 2016. This evening, we return to the time of Cold Mountain to learn about the author's new novel, Verina, in which he tells the story of Varina Howell, wife of the much older Jefferson Davis, and the only First Lady of the Confederate States of America. Now, despite Verina's feelings about Richmond, allow me to note that a reviewer in the Richmond Times-Dispatch calls Verina historical fiction at its finest. It displays Frazier's immense talent and bountiful creativity and evocative prose that possess the rare capacity to impel the reader to stop, reread, and savor a passage. This evening, my colleague Jason Freeman will be in conversation with the author. Please join me in welcoming Charles Frazier and Jason Freeman to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Good evening, everyone. Charles, thank you for being here with us tonight. I think this is an excellent place to start. Wikipedia is a fine resource. Today in history, Union forces captured Richmond on April 3rd, and Abraham Lincoln visited the Confederate capital on April 4th, so it's an auspicious kind of kismet we have tonight. And really, a large focal point of the book, insight into the war, her character, Verina's relationship with Jefferson Davis, is this flight southward at the end of the war. Can you talk about that as sort of a linchpin of this book and of this whole story?
Yeah, a few days before the fall of Richmond, 3 days maybe, it was clear what was going to happen. Lee had sent Jefferson Davis a message saying, "I don't think we can hold the lines in Petersburg much longer." So Varina Davis and her children and a little boy nicknamed Jimmy Limber left Richmond by train, heading south. And the goal was to get to Florida, and then from Florida get to Havana, and then see what happened from there. But that was the idea when she left Richmond. Past Charlotte, where she was met with an angry mob at the train station. Past Charlotte, it became a camping trip. It was going down through South Carolina and Georgia, all the way into very South Georgia. Wagons and horses and that sort of thing. So this woman went from being First Lady of a fake country to being a fugitive on the road.
I'm presuming you knew a lot of this story. I didn't know. I'm a Civil War aficionado, and I'm interested in the characters and the movements. Did you know this about her? Did you know about this specific journey of hers?
I didn't know anything about her. I've never been interested in Jefferson Davis, and didn't know that she was much younger, that she was his second wife. His first wife was Zachary Taylor's daughter, and Zachary Taylor didn't want her to marry Jefferson Davis, and so he resigned from the army to marry this young woman. He was in deep mourning for close to 10 years, and then partly because he was getting political ambitions, and as one writer put it, needed a hostess. He married Varina Davis, who was 17 when she met him, and he was 36, I think it was, and looked older. So if you want a treat, Google Jefferson Davis, like wedding picture, honeymoon picture, and take a look at that, because he looks like a vampire, and he's all stiff, and she has this. He's looking off. She's looking straight at the camera. She's got her chin tucked a little bit and looks really kind of tired and smug. And it just exaggerates even the difference in their ages.
Some of your best descriptions of the book are just of his physical presence, or sort of, as the years go on, lack thereof. And more on her. She's such a frustrating character, and I mean that as a compliment, because she's all of these things, and she takes all these children, not completely alone, but very alone, certainly not without her husband, certainly not with her husband, South, and I come to admire her so much. But still, she is emblematic of the South, of slavery, that kind of thing. I guess my question is, how hard was she to write? How hard was it to maintain a sympathy for this character who is so many different things?
Well, one thing is, I didn't see Varina Davis as heroic when I started the novel, and I didn't see her as heroic at the end. What I was interested in is her complicity in the slave economy, the slave system, the ownership of people. As a 19th century woman, she had only certain, there were very, very clear limits on her influence on her husband's political and moral opinions. What intrigued me is that as she grew older after the war, she lived in London a while, and when he died in 1889, she packed her bags and moved to New York City to become a writer at age 61. That notion of a woman deciding to become a writer at that age, she needed the money, and she was working for mostly a newspaper called the New York World. I thought that is unexpected and interesting, and then I found out that the Southern newspapers were real affronted that she moved to New York City to live with the Yankees, and the people in Richmond got together and found a house and offered her, "You can have this house for the rest of your life." Apparently a very nice house. She said no thank you, that she was going to stay up there, and at some point said, "Next time I go to Richmond will be feet first."
You mentioned this character, this real-life person, briefly. Jimmy Limber, a black child that she, in real life, adopted off the streets of Richmond. The child was 5 or 6?
Yeah, probably. If you Google Jimmy Limber, you'll find a photograph of him. How he happened, I mean, that's another one of those things that seemed so unlikely. This multiracial child living in the Confederate White House with Jefferson Davis's kids. There are some people, like in Mary Chestnut's journals, she seems to indicate that Verina saw him being beaten on the streets of Richmond and picked him up and took him home. There are also accounts that her sons were really wild little kids, and she was criticized all the time for letting her kids just run wild. They were part of a little boys' gang called the Hill Cats, and there's a pretty good chance that this Jimmy Limber who in the book later, when he's a middle-aged man, his name is James Blake. But that he was part of that Hillcats gang, and that the boys knew that he was being beaten by this woman. His mother had died, and that they just brought him home because he needed a place to be. So one way or another, he ended up there living in that house had just a great big children's room, and he ended up living there, taking classes with her kids, that kind of thing.
The novel takes place, and you can jump in a few pages or just kind of flip through the sections and see this. It's very, very nonlinear, and it flashes back, and a lot of it is conversations between the now-grown James, who has sought her out in Saratoga Springs, New York, and New York City, and their conversations. And a lot of this book deals with recollection of the past, memory, that kind of thing. Is this something, and the way we tell stories too, and in telling this story, is that something that was real? Was that something that actually happened, their sort of reconciliation and conversations?
No, this, the Jimmy Limber, the 5 or at that time maybe 6-year-old child, disappears from history. He was separated from her after she was captured, and about a year after that is the last record of him. So I wrote about him as part of that caravan of escapees going down through South Carolina and Georgia, but more and more started thinking, wonder what kind of life that boy had. What were the possibilities? Well, he was in Boston for a while, and I kind of started from there, imagining a life and looking at what the possibilities were for a child like that there, and pictured him getting a good education, which was entirely possible. And living a life of teaching recently enslaved people how to read and do math and do just how to function in the world in ways that had been kept from them, and that at some point he sees a book called Life Amongst the Contrabands by a woman named Elizabeth Bethune. It's a real book, and there's a chapter in it called Jimmy. And I have him buying that book, Life Amongst the Contrabands. He kind of thinks it might be a mystery and takes it off the shelf. And here's a chapter about a little boy, and he doesn't remember that much from that age, but he remembers some things, and he thinks this could be me. So he finds out that she's up in Saratoga Springs for the summer, goes up to the hotel dressed in a very dapper manner, asks to speak to Mrs. Davis, and says, "Is the boy in this book me?" And that starts 7 Sundays of conversations between those two, where he gradually becomes more and more bold in challenging some of her sense of entitlement, her complicity, her she said the right side won the war. She became friends with Julia Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's widow, and they saw their friendship as a public example of reconciliation. She could also drop back into more retrograde kinds of statements like, "Gosh, I wish we could just go back like we were and take care of each other." And he's like, "Really? Really? You think that's the way it was?" And just kind of walks her through an understanding of the wrongness of her position in that regard. So that he's learning about himself and he's learning about her. She tells him at the very beginning, I don't want to talk about that war. I don't want to think about that war. I don't think you should be thinking about that. Think forward. But as soon as he starts asking questions, her memory starts looping back and looping back. And as you said, it's very nonlinear. 1906 is the present time, so you know when you're back at the hotel, 1906. She's almost 80 years old. When they're fleeing, when they're fugitives, 1865. Those things keep repeating and repeating, and then her memory beyond that floats all over the place over seven decades. I want it to be like people's memory really functions especially as they grow older, and they have a lot of memories. So it takes a little bit of it takes a few pages to get the pattern, but there are cues along the way.
Yeah, I love he wants to take notes, and she says, "Let's not get professional. Unreliable memory is all we have here." And as you're reading it, I started seeing their conversation and realizing this wasn't a reunion they got to have, and I'm like, oh, it's kind of Ian McEwan's Atonement, giving them that reunion they were denied in life. But as it goes on, and he questions more, and I'm like, oh no, he's kind of late life devil inquisitor showing up to challenge a lot of her notions. Yeah. And obviously that brings us to now, and it makes me think about the way we tell stories, think about the way we think about the past, and the way people feel about that war still to this day. And I guess the boiled down question I had, and I have now, is why this book? Why this story? How is this talking about today for you?
Well, I never really, after Cold Mountain, wanted to go back to that period, to that war. But the past 3 or 4 years, that war has just, that war and the reminder that it still haunts us has been so apparent in the church shootings in Charleston, the violence in Charlottesville, the arguments over Confederate iconography, the monuments and flags. There's a Uruguayan writer named, I'll butcher his name, Eduardo Gallego or Galeano. But anyway, his quotation is so succinct and so correct and feels so pertinent to the past few years. He wrote, "The past never says goodbye, it says see you later." And that's sort of the way it's felt. I mean, to sit down every day for 4 years working on this book with those reminders that the history of slavery and race and the Civil War in this country is still with us because we never resolved those issues.
There was a short passage from the book that we were talking about that addresses a lot of this stuff too. Do you mind reading that for us tonight? Cool.
So she's thinking, being on the wrong side of history carries consequences. V lives that truth every day. If you've done terrible things, lived a terrible way, profited from pain in the face of history's power to judge, then guilt and loss accrue. Redemption becomes an abstract idea receding before you. Even if your sin, like dirt farmers in Sherman's path, had been simply to live in the wrong place, you suffered. Didn't matter whether you owned slaves or which way you voted or how good your intentions had been or how bad. You might suffer as much as the family of a great plantation, which was maybe not completely just, but if you were the family with a great plantation, you had it coming. Those were times that required choosing a side, and then sooner or later, history asks, which side were you on? The first sound of a culture collapsing from its high steeples starts as a whisper, a sigh, the rattle of windows in their frames. Nobody listens until it thunders, when its structure, all the massive weight held in the air as by a magician's trick, depending on sleight of hand, misdirection of attention, collapses to its foundational sins. And after the steeples have fallen, warred-over landscapes lie buried and salted as thoroughly as Troy after the Greeks sailed home. Nothing left but frail and temporary and untrustworthy memory to imagine what stood before. Even near the end, many in the capital and elsewhere remained unsure whether they were engaged in a grand experiment or a pathetically inept confidence game, projecting boundaries of a new and uncertain country on the landscape, north and south like grotesque reflections of one another in a carnival mirror.
So, thank you for that, by the way. A lot of this book then becomes, the way I look back at, the way I look at these people, the way we look back at them, it's impossible not to see it through the prism of the evils of slavery. And indeed, I feel like in the book we learn so much about certain characters by how they address that. For example, Verina is invited to her former slave's wedding, which is quite magnanimous of Ellen in the book, to invite her. And it gets back to Verina that she just thinks she's okay, like not so great. She's like, how could she say that? We were friends. But it's obviously not an equal relationship. And she's still, I learned so much about her in that moment. And that's taking me to Jefferson Davis, who for me in the book is so oblique. Yeah. And it's almost like we're just looking at him, but he's always off to the side here, and I can't quite figure it out. And I thought it was telling that the most I felt like I learned about him is when Verina talks to his slave, who he considered a friend, but obviously his former slave didn't. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the reasons for making Jefferson.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, I've never been interested in him, and never liked him, and neither did a lot of people who knew him. Sam Houston said, who was a larger than life kind of figure, and knew him pretty well, knew Jefferson pretty well in the Senate, U.S. Senate, said he is as cold as a lizard and ambitious as Lucifer, which was I thought a really that I kept that formula in my mind a lot in writing about him. Everybody, almost everybody, found him cold and distant, and so I wanted him to be that way in the book. There's a scene toward the end where Verina has gone down to Biloxi, Mississippi after a long separation from him, and he's just this kind of ghostly presence in a pale summer suit for the whole scene, and sort of distracted and not connecting with the conversation going on around him. There's also a scene that I really enjoyed writing with Jefferson Davis having dinner with Oscar Wilde, which really happened. Yeah, they were living in a house he inherited from a woman he was living with, and Verina was in London getting all these letters saying, by the way, did you know your husband's living with Sarah Dorsey in Biloxi? He inherited her house, and Oscar Wilde, when he was, I guess, relatively early in his career, was doing one of his big tours in the United States and was speaking in New Orleans, and wanted to come have dinner with the great revolutionary, and I've got a scene where, this part of it is true, that Verina and Oscar Wilde got along very well. Jefferson Davis didn't, and excused himself from the table at some point and went to bed. And Verina asked him the next day, "Why were you so rude to our guest?" And he said, "Because I did not like him." But I've got Verina and Oscar Wilde sitting out on the porch looking at the Gulf of Mexico at night, drinking and having just a little bit of morphine.
Yeah, it's a very My Dinner with Andre kind of moment. And part of the treat of this book, and I encourage you, is, there's such a sense of verisimilitude for, did this actually happen? And it's the one thing I couldn't bring myself to look up because I wanted to believe that it actually happened. And so I'm glad that it did. Can you talk about some of the other cameos in the book, and especially in regard to, we're talking about Southern statues and monuments, and what I kept thinking as I went through the book is we're turning these things back from marble into flesh, and that felt important and gratifying. Can you talk about some of the other personages in there?
Oh gosh, that was one of the kind of the fun things in this, is to write about some of these people without that tired old Southern, ideology and idol worship. So, I mean, who all's in it? Basil Duke. I love Basil Duke. He was a sort of lower level general and looked like Leonardo DiCaprio, and was very vain and loved to. He always looked good, even in really rough circumstances. He always had on clean shirt collars and things like that.
Can you talk about Custer a little bit?
Oh, yeah, this one's good. So in that period, right after the Confederate government fled Richmond, a big chunk of the city burned. It was, still smoldering. Custer's wife, Libby, came down from Washington, knocked on the door of the Confederate White House, and basically said, I'm going to stay for a few days. And so she went up to Verina and Jeff's bedroom and set up her headquarters there. And then Custer, who was farther west, just basically went AWOL, rode his horse as fast as he could to Richmond, and according to the housemaid who was there at the time, he just went bounding up the steps with the scabbard of his sword banging against the stair rails, and then they disappeared into the bedroom for like a day and a half or something. And Verina's hearing the story a few years later, and she's just like, well, I'm glad somebody had some fun in that place.
Yeah, the scabbard banging against the stairs felt like very unveiled symbolism, and well, and on this more serious note, you use the phrase "tired Southern ideology," and there's so many quotable lines to this. And at one point, when they're on the Gulf and they're with it's Sarah Dorsey, and Jefferson is writing his memoirs, and they're talking with such aplomb and such lofty things about, writing this. And Verina, who is so prescient at times, says, the Confederacy wasn't the Roman Empire, just 4 apocalyptic years, a blink of an eye with a horrible cost. And then Jefferson seemed not to hear, maybe listening exclusively to the tide. And I found that really interesting. And again, getting back to this idea of addressing and deconstructing these ideas. And again, this is a big question. What do you hope to accomplish with this book?
Well, one thing I'm interested in is is one thing is deflating those kinds of things, and also the complexity of the situation, the nuances of the situation, that nothing was ever monolithic in the South. I wanted the nuances of the situation. I wanted to look at the way that if you look at slavery in the Western Hemisphere and when countries abolished slavery, one country after another was abolishing slavery. And the United States, we were one of the last. I mean, Brazil was one of the last. But much of South America, for example, had already abolished slavery. The writing was on the wall, and people like Jefferson Davis just refused to see it. That was an institution that was going to be wiped away, and he took the country into a devastating war, costing more lives than any other war in our history because we were killing each other. So some of that I wanted to just talk about who those people that these monuments are to in a more realistic way. And in Cold Mountain, I treat people like Lee and Longstreet with a great deal of cynicism, mostly through Inman's attitude toward them. I mean, those monuments are interesting to me, and it's a problem that the South is in the process of dealing with, and it's unclear how cities are going to deal with them. I mean, some cities like New Orleans moved quickly and clearly on that issue. A lot of people don't realize that those monuments didn't start popping up right after the war. They're mostly a product of the Jim Crow years, or that those carvings of Lee and Jefferson Davis and whoever the other one is, probably Stonewall, on Stone Mountain in Atlanta. That wasn't even finished until 1972, and seems so clearly a reaction to the Civil War, to the Civil Rights Movement, to me it's a very hard argument to make that those monuments are history, and we should not be trying to erase history. Certainly don't belong on public land.
Yeah. Parts of the book seem so optimistic and so, a page later, maybe a little bit cynical, and again, just like real life is. And, we have Verina who reads ancient Greek and, is extremely educated, and she takes this long view, maybe the world's always been like this. And it always and James is like, no, this doesn't excuse you from this. And I think what a compelling scene for me is, and I don't want to give too much away, but James gets on a train and it's going south, and he has to move to the back, and it shows that these things are still happening. And like Barbara Fields in the Ken Burns Civil War documentary says, we can still lose the Civil War. It's still happening. What do you think the danger is of forgetting now?
Yeah, well, it's that. I think it's related to that quotation I gave a while ago. History says, "See you later." That forgetting history, forgetting the culpability, forgetting the damage and devastation, the ruin of so many lives. That is not going to serve the culture well, to pretend that didn't happen.
So in my college class, we're talking about editing and the process of editing. What was your relationship like with your editor, and how did that ensure historical accuracy?
Well, when I'm writing a book, I don't like anybody to see it for a long time, and that makes editors nervous. But my writing is not linear. There's nothing for them to see, and they start imagining, that there are big problems or something. So when they see it, it's getting closer to being. They've got a whole book to read. It may need some tweaking. It may need some adjusting, all that. And I value the help of editors at that point. Before that, I don't want to hear too many opinions. I just want to write the book and get it to a place where I feel like okay, it's not finished, but it's kind of there.
Other questions from the audience, and well, I have one while you're thinking about it, and it's also kind of a craft question here. Is there a stylistic reason that you refer to her? I could be mistaken, but the only time that it says Verina is on the cover of the book, she's always referred to as V. Is there a stylistic reason you did that?
Part of it was for me, and maybe for the reader, to differentiate the historic Varina Howell Davis from the fictional character in the book. I started that from the very beginning of it. Yeah. Oh, back to the editorial thing for 1 second. There's a Philadelphian here tonight who was very helpful in that editing process. I won't make you stand up, but Kelly Carl helped. Was an early reader and made some really helpful suggestions and was important to the process. And she got it at that point where I'm ready for somebody to look at this and react.
I was intrigued by the relationship between Verina and the widowed president's wives, her going to visit them as if she were the only person who remembered they even existed. Was that based on historical fact?
Yeah, she and, you're talking about Julia Grant particularly? Yeah, that was another thing that infuriated Southern newspapers, that she and Julia Grant became friends. They vacationed together some. They had regular scheduled rides through Central Park in carriages. They liked to go to prominent restaurants where they would be seen and commented on, and they liked it when their names were in the paper as having been seen together. And part of that was that sense of making their friendship a public example of reconciliation of the country. Verina is in part of her writing career, wrote a piece, an admiring piece about Ulysses S. Grant that was, I think, in connection with the dedication of Grant's tomb. Yeah, that was an interesting bit for me, that when Franklin Pierce was elected, shortly before he came to Washington, their son, who was probably 8 or 9, I think I'm remembering right, was killed horrifically in front of them by being struck by a train. And she just basically stayed upstairs in the White House and didn't have much public to do. And so the papers loved that. They could make her the crazy woman in the attic, that kind of thing. And so Verina kind of sneaks up there to see what she's really like and finds not a crazy woman in the attic, and they become friends. So that's one of those little bits. She knew Washington was a small town back then, and the White House was kind of wide open, and she was around the White House a whole lot when she was 18, 19 years old.
Can you talk just a little bit while we're waiting on another question about, there's something prophetic about her relationship with Jane, about her own children, and this is addressed early on, so it's not spoilery, guys.
Yeah, one of Verina's children, Joe, fell from the balcony of the Confederate White House and it was cobblestones underneath, and was killed there. And there's a scene early in the book of that. And then her children died just one by one, 6 kids. At the present time of this book, her daughter Maggie is still alive, but lives in Colorado. So she's got that sense of loss. And when this grown-up little boy shows up, it's like the return of a child to her in a way. She's thought he was probably dead too, and then there is this grown and accomplished man.
Can you talk a little bit about her writing career? Did she write before she went up to New York and was hired by the paper?
Yeah, she was a really good letter writer, though there aren't that many of her letters left because she usually wrote at the bottom, "Burn after reading." She was known as a wit. I mean, maybe the primary wit among Washington wives when Jefferson was in the House and then later the Senate and then became a cabinet member. In New York, she wrote columns, various kinds of things. For a while, she did an advice column, like an early Dear Abby, and some of those still exist. The one that I like, this young woman writes asking that she says that a young man that she's seeing has asked for a lock of her hair. How should I respond? And Verina's response was, that is too disgusting to respond.
It would be funny if it weren't so grotesque. There's another part. Can you talk about Verina's honeymoon? There's something in there that is unbelievable, and I had to look it up.
Yeah. So something went on during their engagement, and I don't even have a good theory as to what it was. They were going to get married. They were going to have a pretty big wedding, both sides of the family, all that. And then all of a sudden the wedding was off. And then all of a sudden the wedding was on, but the big wedding was off. They got married in the side yard of her parents' house. None of his people came. She just went to the closet and picked out a dress and went to the garden and plucked a rose and put it in her hair, and that was it. On the way to New Orleans for their honeymoon, they stopped to visit the grave of Jefferson's first wife. Yeah. So that pretty well indicated to her what her position was, and she always felt second with Noxie. I mean, like one of his nieces before the wedding wrote her a letter saying, "Oh, poor Jeff, he opened up a trunk and there was a pair of Noxie's slippers in there that he didn't know were in that trunk, and he fainted." Which was, that's what she chose to write to Verina right before their wedding.
Hi, I'm going to compress two into one. Can you talk a bit about the Blue Book that you mentioned? And then, I know this is entirely unfair, and that books demand to be written when they're written, but if this book had been written 20 years prior, can you talk about how you think it might be different, or do you have any concept of the difference that in the writing?
I'll answer the first one and think about the second one while I'm answering it. The Blue Book, was Elizabeth Bethune was a teacher in Boston, and I think she was connected with Universalists and Unitarians. And my Western North Carolina family has a Universalist background. So I was interested in that. When the Sea Islands were captured, and that was in case you don't know every little detail of Civil War troop movements and things, which I don't either, but the Sea Islands were captured early. So all that stuff down there, Charleston, north and south, the Hilton Head, that area, captured by the Federals. The enslaved people were freed, and Elizabeth Bethune and some other young women went down to teach those the particularly the children, but also the adults, even basic things that had been withheld from them, like money, how to use money, how to look at a coin and tell what it's worth, how to tell time, those kinds of things were where they started. It was a dangerous thing because if the South had recaptured the islands, she would have been in a pretty difficult position. But at some point after the war, after Jimmy Limber had been separated from Verina, he came under her care, and she found him. Everybody who knew him and wrote about him always called him a really bright little boy. And she would go back home to Massachusetts in the summer, and took him with her. And he was in school up there for a little while, and he was treated badly by children, black children and white children. He didn't fit anywhere, and that's part of how I wrote the character, is somebody who's always felt like he's never at home anywhere. In the Blue Book, she indicates that he may have drifted off to an orphanage. She left him at an orphanage is apparently what happened. But that's it. That's the last record. It's an interesting book about getting to South Carolina, getting to those plantations that had been abandoned by their owners, and what she found there, and how she began setting up a school for these children. Yeah.
You had a second part to that about, yeah.
If I were writing this 20 years ago, how might it have been different? One of the things I'm pretty proud of with Cold Mountain, given that I began writing that in 1990 approximately, is the attitude toward those Confederate leaders. So I don't think the role of Jefferson Davis would have been much different in the book. But I do think that the events of the past 4 years made me think every day about the legacy of the Confederacy, and just that war was so completely unnecessary and how many lives were ruined by it. Just in my family, 4 brothers, one of them my great-great-grandfather went to that war. They didn't own slaves. 2 of them died in the war, 2 of them made it back. When my great-great-grandfather came back, he had become a Universalist, and the rest of his life was spent with that very kind of benign and liberal kind of religion in the forefront. Built a little chapel called Inman's Chapel that still exists in western North Carolina. A Frazier ancestor, did not believe in, he was against slavery, against the war. He did not want to go fight in that war. Went up in the mountains and hid. But he had to come into town sometimes to get supplies. And one day he came into town and was shot dead in the streets of a little town in upstate South Carolina. Those are just 2 little, just 2 little personal indications of the loss and devastation of that war that was widespread. Just a totally stupid and devastating war that should have been resolved in other ways.
There's a very brief passage toward the end of the book that I put a whole bunch of exclamation marks next to, and it really dovetails actually both of those questions. And I resisted reading too much into it, but it says, especially, Jimmy Limbert writes, especially since I found the Blue Book, I've come to see Mr. Davis and his beliefs this way. He did as most politicians do, except more so, corrupt our language and symbols of freedom, pervert our heroes, because, like so many of them, he held no beloved idea or philosophy as tightly as his money purse. Take a king or a president or anybody. I know demagoguery is timeless, but it really invites present day interpretation. Was that pointed?
Yeah.
All right, next question, unless you want to address that more.
Finish that little bit.
Okay. That is on page, I really felt the need to mark up my book on this one. Take a king or a president or anybody. Well, why don't you read the rest of it? It's right there towards the end of the page. Nobody cares about me reading it.
Put a heavy sack of gold in one hand and a feather-light declaration about freedom in the other. And then an outlaw sticks a pistol in his face and says, give me one or the other. Every time, 10 out of 10, he'll hug the sack and throw away the ideals, because the sack's what's behind the ideals, like the foundation under a building. And that's how freedom and chains and a whipping post can live alongside each other comfortably.
I'm interested in the way you use music in both Cold Mountain and Nightwoods, and I'm wondering if you had a soundtrack while you were writing this novel.
Yeah. I mean, the one song that is in the book repeatedly is at the resort hotel in Saratoga. And there's this young woman there who I just loved writing about. And she's trying to learn how to play Scott Joplin's Sunflower Slow Drag. So she sits at the piano in the lobby of this resort hotel trying to play it. And you know, Scott Joplin, even something called slow drag is pretty fast. And she just can't get it. So she starts playing it slower and slower and slower over the course of the book. And toward the end, it just sounds like, I think Verina thinks it sounds like wind chimes on a day with just barely a breeze. But that song I listen to over and over. I don't know why, but the stuff I listened to the most while I was writing this book was like Scandinavian composers, Icelandic composers, Olafur Arnalds, this kind of floaty, dark sounding music. It felt like the right soundtrack somehow.
I have been told it is the end of our evening, unfortunately. I'm sure we could stay here all night, but we gotta pay the bills. Ladies and gentlemen, before you join us upstairs for the book signing, a great round of applause for Charles Frazier.
Thank you.